right, welcome everyone. We are going to get started. My name is Alex Cortez. I'm with Bellwether Education. I'd like to begin with a big thanks to our panelists and also to New Profit for funding this work, and to all of the organizations and leaders who we learn from and who are part of the journey. I'd like to quickly begin by introducing our panelists. Jaclyn Piñero, who is the CEO of uAspire. Justin Wells, the Executive Director of Envision Learning Partners, and Alan Safran, the co-founder and CEO of Saga Education, as well as my co-author and colleague, Christine Wade, who will be leading the discussion and Q&A. We will begin with a short PowerPoint introduction because we are consultants, it's a little obligatory, and then we're going to learn from our panelists about the experiences they've had in thinking about these three different strategies for impact, and then we'll end with Q&A from the audience. On that note, please feel free to submit questions in the question component of Zoom as we go, and we'll try to bundle and curate the questions for the final third of the presentation. We will also be sharing this as a video recording on the website with the rest of the content, probably within a week after today. And for a fuller version of the PowerPoint we're about to go through, the full essay and a set of case studies on uAspire, Envision, Saga, please visit the website online, which we will post in the chat. So we want to begin by defining our terms. So we looked at sort of three different strategies for impact. There's direct impact, which is how an organization provides programming directly to its target beneficiaries. Second is widespread impact, how an organization builds the capacity of partners to implement key elements of its program model. And then there's systemic impact, how an organization shifts mindsets, relationships, and power to in turn shift policy, practice, and resource flows to create the conditions for adoption of an organization's program much more broadly and to ultimately achieve their vision of change. Starting with direct impact. This is where many organizations start, although that need not be true for everyone. But we see, and in our research found that a lot start in direct impact because leaders like the panelists and people on the call have an innovation and an idea that they want to directly deliver and control the prototype, improve, to maintain quality. They may want to make sure that they're proximate to the beneficiaries and communities being served to really understand their needs, create authentic relationships, and get direct feedback on the model. They may want to test different variations of the model, be it dosage or format or technology. They may need to be in a position where they want to build a strong evidence base of what works and also for whom and under what conditions. And they may grow through direct impact because there's simply a big market demand to grow directly. And so some organizations just focus on scaling direct impact. What we also have found though, and we think this is something we've seen exacerbated over the course of the COVID journey we've all been on, is that some organizations face direct impact fatigue. Because let's face it, growing models is hard. It's hard in general. It's been particularly hard the last couple of years. Some organizations face limits on their desire to build organizational complexity or talent pipelines or larger systems and structures that need to be reinvented periodically as you get bigger. Some organizations shared with us that they were facing limits on funding or the limits on their appetite and size of fundraising they wanted to take on. So one leader shared with us that they have a $36 million annual mortgage running their programming across 8 sites across the country. And they couldn't imagine coming out of COVID, doubling that to a $72 million mortgage in 16 sites. Some organizations face limits on direct impact because of the market's willingness to purchase. And in some cases, working with schools or communities or partners who say, we love what you've done, we now want you to teach us how to do it, which presents a new market opportunity, but is not necessarily direct impact. Some people face basic constraints on systemic conditions about funding or caps. And then some organizations have decided they simply cannot grow at the speed and ambition they want purely through direct impact. So that brings us to the second impact strategy, widespread impact, which again, we define as how an organization builds the capacity of partners to implement key elements of their program model. And what Christine and I found is that organizations thinking about widespread impact go through a process of what we called high impact Jenga. So if you've played Jenga, you know sort of the direct model is your tower. It's everything you do. And some organizations want to think about, how do I take one piece and share it with partners? How do I think about partners who I want to have build a lot of our tower? But how do we make sure we do this so that expectations and resources can't misalign with the ability to implement? And so what Christina and I found is that organizations going through this process of high impact Jenga think about the following 5 design considerations. The first is breadth versus depth of impact. Now, if an organization can scale its impact more broadly without making a trade-off in the depth of per capita impact, it should absolutely do that. But most organizations reach a point where they have to make this trade-off. So that's usually the first design consideration. That then leads to considerations around fidelity and control, with the general rule of thumb that the deeper impact you want to have through a partner, the more fidelity you're going to want in how they adapt your model, and therefore the more control. That then leads to trade-offs and levels of investment, both your investment and prospective partner investment. That then leads to impact around and trade-offs around what can be measured. And that in turn all sort of determines what your target market is. And so in thinking through these 5 design considerations, what we learned is that organizations thinking about widespread impact think across a range of different widespread impact models. On the left side of the continuum is more of the breadth models like free resources or convenings that are sort of in the inspire mode, and they have lower fidelity, they're lower investment. They may be more limited in what you can measure. So measuring more around reach and engagement, maybe satisfaction, but it's a much larger potential market. And then there's sort of the interim between breadth and depth of things like fee-based resources or trainings where you're starting to ask your partners to make certain commitments. And then on the depth side of the continuum, you have things like consulting and cohort capacity building, which are usually around an expectation of much deeper impact. So usually there's much higher expectations of fidelity by your partners, a much higher investment, but you can measure more up to what actions they take, and in some cases, student outcomes. But because of that level of investment and expectation and commitment, it's a smaller target market. And we laid this out as what we call a pragmatic playbook, not a recipe, because we see organizations playing across these different widespread impact models. And different organizations, based on their values and beliefs, are going to make different trade-offs. Some organizations just focus on something like cohort capacity building. Others will decide that they just are focused on free resources. Yet others begin in one model and expand. And in the case, and as we'll talk about with our panelists, some people play across a whole bunch of these. And we think all of those are legitimate choices. They are all trade-offs organizations can make. And the thing is, these are not mutually exclusive models. So what we found is quite often people might begin, or in the course of their offering sort of stuff on the breadth side of the continuum on the left-hand page, is not only do free resources and things like that create intrinsic value, but it will build awareness and interest from partners to maybe want to go from the breadth to depth continuum and adopt more of a commitment over time. And then, of course, as you're leading things on the depth side of the model, you are learning things that you can then codify and share back through free resources and convenings on the breadth side, as well as actually contributing to your core direct model. That then brings us to the third strategy around impact that we grew into. And when we started this, we were very much focused just on the direct to widespread. But what we found is, again and again, organizations were really starting to think about systemic impact. And I think we do find this is very important, because I think one of the challenges in education reform has been sort of what we call sort of a field of dreams as theory of change, and homage to the movie quote, "If you build it, they will come." And there have been lots of great efforts that were that had good intent and got good results. And so the idea was, we get good results, everyone will follow us into the field. And we, I think, have all, to various degrees, discovered that that's not always how change works at a systemic level, because education systems are not wholly rational systems. They're political systems. They are a complex web of money, power, interest, and values, which is not unreasonable since they're human systems. But I think many of us have found, in order to scale our innovation, if it's going to disrupt the status quo of money, power, interest, and values, systems can be resistant. And so we very much appreciate and ascribe to the FSG framework on the left of the 6 different elements of systems change. So how do you think about shifting mindsets or mental models, to in turn shift relationships and power, to then think about how you shift policy, practice, and resource flows. And more organizations we see are playing in this space and seeing the importance of it, but realizing it is very complex. It is a different skill set than direct or widespread. And so what we see on sort of the right-hand side of the page is there a set of design considerations organizations go through. First of all, identifying what system does an organization seek to influence. Second, what changes does it actually want to achieve for a given system? So what's the agenda for change? Third, how are those changes achieved? What are the different tactics and models for influencing a change system? What does that mean for who needs to be involved? And then we put this meta question over all 4 because we think it's essential to consider across all 4, which is, what is the role and leadership that communities most impacted by education systems have in setting the agenda and driving this change. Because that's another thing that classically too much of ed reform has ignored and marginalized and not thought about, which is how does the community or communities we're trying to serve set that agenda? So I want to end with how these three strategies sort of play with each other. So again, starting with direct impact, which again is by no means where everyone starts. This begins quite often to be the test kitchen for organizations to demonstrate what works to be replicated by others. That then helps them think about their widespread impact strategies. Widespread impact not only helps many more people adopt their model, but we found in many cases it provides a scale to fund R&D that might benefit your direct impact, and it creates its own lessons to share back with the direct impact. Then from direct to systemic, as organizations get bigger and they provide more evidence and build more credibility, they can choose to be in a position to influence systems. And again, there are a lot of different strategies that can be through partnership and influencing those through advocacy, through writing, through awareness. Others develop coalitions and think about movement building. And of course, widespread impact also contributes to systemic impact because it builds a coalition of partners with shared values and who can provide broader proof points of your program success beyond just your direct impact. It also gives organizations visibility and credibility to understand what change is needed. So it's one thing if you're operating in 5 cities through direct impact, if you're operating in 15 more cities through widespread, you're seeing the structural and policy and practice changes across those, and it gives you more of an insight. And of course, when systemic impact is successful, it creates the conditions to enable broader adoption of programming aligned to an organization's ultimate vision, and not the least of which is funding. And as one leader shared with us, in some ways, systemic impact is sometimes the ultimate in business development, because at the end of the day, around education, the vast majority of spending is around social systems. One last point on this is, while we share this, we were excited about this, we've learned a lot, we're not espousing that every organization should think about all 3 strategies. Every organization has got to take its own journey to think about which one it wants to play in, how they support each other, how they resource it. Some organizations will actually spin off their widespread impact strategies into their own organizations. Some will think about pursuing systemic impact through partnerships. And on the other side, we've seen examples, we may hear from one, where organizations have actually acquired and merged with other entities in order to build their skill set. So thank you for the sort of upfront PowerPoint monologue. At this point, I'd love to turn it over to my colleague, Christine, and to our panelists to share more about their journey.
Thanks so much for walking us through that overview, Alex. I am excited to have the chance to pass the mic to our panelists, and I feel very fortunate to have been able to spend a lot of time learning from them and their colleagues to create the detailed case studies on each of their organizations. And as Alex mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, we will make sure to reshare the links to the full playbook as well as those case studies as a follow-up from today. I'm going to start by asking a couple of questions that are often top of mind to our panelists, but then we will turn it over to Q&A from all of you, our audience members. So please look for that Q&A button on your Zoom panel and submit your questions, and we'll begin working through them in a couple of minutes. So to get us started, I'd love to give each panelist first the opportunity to briefly introduce yourself to the group, and then tell us why your organization expanded from direct impact into widespread and systemic. What was the strategic imperative? Jaclyn, why don't I hand it to you first, and then we'll pass to Alan and then Justin.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. Again, my name is Jaclyn Piñero. I am the CEO of uAspire. I will just say that I am a first-generation college graduate, the daughter of immigrant parents. My journey to this work and the mission that we seek to meet as uAspire is very personal to me. So that makes me very excited to be in this conversation with each of you and to share some of what we as uAspire have learned, but also how we use lived experience to guide our choices and our learnings. But to answer your question, Christine, one of the reasons why uAspire moved from direct to widespread to systemic was just the issue that we work on day in and day out of college affordability is so big and so intractable that we knew as an organization, and we took the responsibility that we cannot just stay at a direct service model focus. We had to understand where we could provide our influence, where we should be putting more resources to kind of bookend the issue, because we are under the guise of federal and state systems, and we don't have full control to necessarily change those in the way that we know our students need them to be changed. We knew that going to the systemic level and focusing in the way that we did on advocacy and systems change work would result in either breaking down the systems that our students needed to be broken down so that they can access the funds that are available to them, or influencing the systems to change such that the effect at the end of the day is less students that we would need to serve directly on the ground. One goal of uAspire is to, for each generation or each class of students that are coming through our services, it's actually, can we serve less students because we have impacted the system at the top end to make the dollars that are available to them through financial aid systems easier to access, therefore lessening the need for an organization like uAspire to exist at the ground level.
Thanks, Christine, and welcome everybody to the webinar. I'm Alan Safran. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Saga Education. We're the nation's most trusted partner in the area of high impact tutoring. Co-founded Saga with a guy named AJ Gutierrez, who I was, when I was the director of a high school in Boston called Match, he was a 9th grader there. He's on this call, and you'd be delighted to meet him if you get an opportunity. And when he became an 11th grader, we started at that school a high dosage tutoring program. Every student, including AJ, got 2 hours of his 8-hour high school day in personalized tutoring sessions. First time in our knowledge that a public school in America had built tutoring as part of the fabric of its program for every student. And from there, we generated some pretty terrific results at that little school. Then we went to Houston in 2010 to work in the Apollo 20 project as consultants to set up high dosage tutoring there. Of the 5 interventions tried in Apollo 20, the high dosage tutoring was the most effective. Then AJ and I spun off from that Match school, created a little unit there to try to disseminate this idea. We started in Lawrence, Massachusetts under a state receivership. At that time, the state receiver was Jeff Riley. Now he's the commissioner of education in Massachusetts. And we got the biggest single year turnaround in state history in Massachusetts in terms of the student growth percentile in math, which was the subject we were tutoring in 2 of Lawrence's 6 high schools. Then we went on the road, Stamford, Connecticut, Chicago, and now our direct program is in 6 different locations, including some of the biggest in the country, New York and Chicago, and some smaller like Providence, Rhode Island, Charleston, South Carolina, and Washington, D.C. In our direct program, we tutor as part of the school day. That's the innovation. You make it high dosage every day. Kid gets tutoring. Make it high relationship. The tutor stays with the kid as their student and as part of their caseload for the year. And the ratio of tutor to student never exceeds 1 to 3 in a live setting. As Alex mentioned earlier, we acquired a company a couple of years ago called Woot Math because we wanted a technology expertise. And part of the reasons we wanted that, besides COVID, was we wanted to get tutoring out to the country. We thought early on, even in our 2nd year, we started to consult in the Netherlands, been doing that for 6 years. Set up a successful program there. We knew that this was a good idea, that tutoring, if it could scale, if it could be done affordably, could make the difference in public education. Because the truth is, I've seen this for 18 years now. In public schools in America, kids arrive at 9th grade on average 3 years behind grade level. These are the largest and medium urban districts in this country, year after year, city after city. Our kids are arriving 3 years behind grade level. How can they be expected to succeed at grade 9? And so many drop out because they fail Algebra 1. We said we'll intervene right there with a high dosage tutoring program. And it's been shown by 8 randomized controlled trials now to be the most effective intervention ever rigorously studied in American high schools, according to the University of Chicago. So I think at the root of it is a passion. I'm the son of 2 educators. AJ, first in his family to go to college, son of a single mom, a Posse scholar, not a good student. When he came to our high school, became one of the superstars of American public education after he graduated with his scholarship and majored in philosophy at college. We have a passion that this will work. This, if done well, tutoring will work and can change American schools and the trajectory of lives of 1 million kids a year who fail Algebra 1. So we felt a moral imperative to get to widespread impact. We see systemic obstacles to this scaling. The cost. AmeriCorps has a couple of misalignments with this growing. State regulations on time and learning don't credit qualified tutoring time as instructional time. So there are a lot of systemic issues we need to clear the path for, and we're pushing forward to become partners with states and districts around this country, some of it, much of it for free, to help them do this right. Because if they do it right, public education will change, and kids who have been failed, not failed, but been failed by our system will succeed.
Thanks, Alan. It's fun to be trading our these organizational stories. Hello, everybody. I'm Justin Wells. I'm the Executive Director of Envision Learning Partners, which is part of a larger organization called Envision Education. It's important to say both of those because that kind of describes the relationship between how we started with direct impact, as Alex mentioned, is a typical beginning. Envision Education runs 5 small charter schools in the San Francisco Bay Area. I was actually a founding teacher back in 2003 when we first started with 109th graders, and still very much identify as a teacher. It just kind of, I see my classroom kind of getting bigger and bigger, which is exciting. And I think in many ways, because we were founded, our founder, Bob Lenz, was taught in a mainstream comprehensive high school, and just, see school districts as the place where we're educating America's children, but just wanted a chance to kind of like play out some more ideas with a few small high schools. But there was never the intention of Envision to kind of just grow by keep growing more and more schools. From the very beginning, and we're proud of the fact it's kind of true to the original charter vision, to the degree that we had ideas that people were drawn to, we would just willingly share those. What are the ideas? Specifically, we're really interested in the intersection between project-based learning and authentic assessment. We're particularly known for students doing kind of a rite of passage portfolio, what we call a portfolio defense. And it's largely we're serving students who will be first in their families to attend college. We're particularly proud of having a strong kind of pro-Black vision and pedagogy in our schools in Oakland and San Francisco, Hayward, and really see that the authentic assessment piece is key to students, kind of discovering who they are as intellectuals and students and aspiring for various goals in their lives. And it's very powerful to see our students do their defenses of learning at 8th, 10th, and 12th grades. And for that reason, folks in school districts were kind of knocking on the door and interested in learning more about what we were up to. So our widespread impact kind of did emerge, although I think we always wanted to have that intention. It did emerge, I think, organically from just wanting to share. We did make the move, interestingly, to kind of name a particular subdivision in our org, Envision Learning Partners, which I do think we suddenly saw way more widespread impact, because we had people that were waking up in the morning thinking exclusively about how to serve partner districts and other schools. And that's where I feel like we started realizing, oh, wow, this is a powerful way to get back to our somewhat vague intention in the beginning to share our learning. So we were clear, and until we talked to Bellwether, I don't think we necessarily had the terms for these things, but we had a sense of ourselves as the direct and widespread impact, because we actually had 2 subdivisions of the organization and developed a fee-for-service business working with school districts, all still part of the same nonprofit organization. And then we were able to kind of start Jefferson County Public Schools in Louisville, Los Angeles Unified, et cetera, large numbers of students that are doing portfolio defenses and other forms of authentic assessment through coaching and consulting. I think that, and we'll say more about this, but suddenly, though, I think it's the relationship between direct and widespread impact that made us realize the power of getting involved in opportunities for systemic impact. And in some ways, we were invited into those spaces because we have experience doing both direct and widespread. We started getting involved in sort of collaborations of groups that were trying to inform some federal policy around alternative forms of assessment, state boards of education, consortia of districts that are trying to wrangle and think about assessment differently. We started getting invited into those spaces because of our experience. And then we also realized this is worth our time to be involved in systemic impact, because we can maybe make some of the things that we're experiencing as headwinds feel more like tailwinds when the policy, the assessment policy framework and other things. State of Colorado is a great example where some beautiful changes have occurred at the state level that make more districts able to take on things like portfolio defense, project-based learning, et cetera. So that's a bit of how I think the Bellwether framework has beautifully described the arc of Envision education and Envision learning partners. And it's been fun to now have the language and diagrams and phrases to kind of help us even think about how we can continue doing this in the future.
Thank you all for sharing some of the why behind your work, as well as some of the what of how you've thought about your direct, widespread, and systemic approaches. Now that we have that better sense for the origin of your journeys, I'm going to ask each of you a question around an area we know organizations grapple with when first expanding into widespread or even considering further growing or scaling their widespread and systemic impact. So Jaclyn, I'll start with you. One of the biggest questions we receive and an underlying anxiety we know organizations face is how to manage growth and complexity and coordination when you have multiple impact strategies at play. How has uAspire managed its growth and create coordination as an organization?
Sure. So it's an ongoing part of management, understanding how the interplay between our direct service, our widespread, and our systemic work builds off of and learns from each other. So for me, stepping into the CEO-ship a few years ago, it was imperative that we found that next evolution or that next solution for managing the coordination and complexities from an org design lens and also a leadership lens. So it was imperative for me that I had somebody on my team whose sole responsibility was to oversee the interplay of our models. And so one of the changes that I made on my executive team was to create the position of Chief Impact Officer. Previously, our impact models were delegated to two different leaders, and that was powerful in its own ways, but it also created more complexities just in terms of communication, strategy alignment, et cetera. So there was a strategic redesign of the executive team and the leadership responsibility and an actual job focus on the interplay of our models together. So that was both from the org design perspective, but for me, it was a leadership lens too. And so the whole scale responsibility of our Chief Impact Officer is this umbrella view or the bird's eye view of the interplay. The important thing, the kind of second line and where the rubber meets the road for our Chief Impact Officer, her name is Piñero. She's out of our New York office, is that she has a leadership team who understands that their responsibility as it rolls up into Genera is to focus on strategy and growth and the management of the complexities in our advising, in our training and technical assistance, on our systemic advocacy side, and that they understand their responsibilities to coordinate and communicate with each other as well. So it's really, again, the leadership perspective as it rolls from more the on-the-ground approach with Genera's line, and then between Genera and the other executive team members, and then with me as CEO, so that we keep our eye on that prize. We are watching and threading the needle of those complexities and of the management across the learning and the growth and the challenges of having multi-strategies and various localities across the country.
Alan, would love to talk to you a little bit more about your widespread impact models and the range of models. You mentioned earlier in your introduction that Saga has had multiple randomized controlled trials demonstrating the strong effectiveness of your direct model. But at the same time, you're willing to show flexibility in pursuing a range of breadth to depth widespread impact strategies. What has been the philosophy or values behind the decision to expand into that range of widespread impact models?
That's a good question. I think you're asking fundamentally, like, what's our philosophy of or a theory of change for America's schools? And I think it rests on probably 5 beliefs. Number one, relationships are crucial. Kids need to feel connected to a caring adult at every grade in our system. And by high school, there's less and less of that. It needs to be more and more of that. I think second, it's not the kid's fault if they're not succeeding. We believe it's the school's obligation to provide the opportunities and supports to help kids succeed. But if kids fail, we do not believe and to subscribe to the belief that it was the kid's fault. We think all kids can succeed. This is a fundamental belief of everybody who works at Saga. We think that schools can do better, would be the fourth thing I'd say as a philosophy. And we think fifth, if school's going to change for the better of kids, the equity requires that we work within the school day, that interventions and supports are not out of school time or on demand from kids who might be at home. That's the least equitable way to do it. To build in something successful in our public schools, we need to work within our public schools and the communities in which we serve to build it as part of the regular program that's offered and provided to kids in America. Those are fundamental core beliefs for us and expressed in every one of our models where, relationship is key. We do in-person tutoring and we support districts to do in-person. We do remote tutoring, but the platform has got to be one that recreates in the vertical technology environment what used to be across the table in the horizontal environment. And if it can recreate it well with audio and visual, smiles and gather feeling of belonging, then a remote environment can work for kids. And in fact, we've identified 9 ways that remote tutoring might in fact become more effective than in-person tutoring. I'd love to offline answer people's questions about that. But fundamentally, the core belief of all of this, relationships are central and we need to foster those.
Thanks, Ellen. And I feel like in talking with you about the various Saga widespread impact models in your case study, I see a range of sort of entry points with potential partners, starting with some free resources that might help someone get started or build their interest, all the way to the idea of doing deeper focused consulting one-on-one with the district or a school as they think about sort of standing up their own model. Why sort of that spectrum and not focusing in one place or one widespread impact model?
Well, because districts are at different places, states are in different places, schools are certainly at different places. And we'll start, just like we start with kids where they are in a tutorial, we'll start with states and districts where they are. There's a state, Oklahoma, that has a significant interest now in out of school time tutoring. Really, we don't believe that's going to be as effective, but we've started with Oklahoma to try to help them do that well. And once we're in partnership with that state, we'd like to persuade them to try on a pilot basis what we think will be more effective for kids, which will be the in-school day model. So we'll work with people where they are. I think there's a growing sense across this country, COVID made clear, schools must do better and they're not doing well enough for kids. And COVID now put more pressure. They want to try different things. We'll help them, but fundamentally, after 18 years of doing this, we think we have our hands on the steering wheel of what will be the standards and expectations that will make a program effective. And we'd like to share that with the country.
Thanks, Ellen. Speaking of meeting people and districts or communities where they are, Justin, I'd love to pivot to a question for you. Some of the most important decisions we see organizations make in their widespread impact strategy is both around what non-negotiables it sets with its partners to implement a widespread impact version of its model, but also where it's then giving partners explicit space to customize, co-design, and innovate to best meet the needs of the communities they serve and leverage the strengths of their community. How have you decided what is non-negotiable and where you create explicit space for partners to customize to their local context?
Yeah, again, kind of an organic journey where we, I think, started kind of more conventionally thinking, oh, some folks are knocking on the door. We call ourselves Envision Schools. They must be interested in the quote unquote Envision model. And we'll share, kind of an undifferentiated mix of these aspects of things. And then even then the language of like, what's non-negotiable, et cetera, was kind of probably our mentality when we started. But I think we soon realized we needed to mature beyond that. People weren't they were interested in some really powerful student forms of student work and student practices and student voice, which we realized was all about actually opening up possibilities for different ways for students to express themselves. And we needed to actually practice what we preach, even in our working with in a widespread impact way. Beautifully, one of our very first folks we worked with was a small school in Hawaii that loved the concept of students defending their learning publicly. It very resonated with some indigenous traditions that were part of the school's mission. And right off the bat, like the students were doing half of their defense in Native Hawaiian. It was immediately not looking like an Envision defense, but also beautifully so honoring the principles but in a way that was absolutely a flowering of what was happening in that community. And it was a huge aha for us to realize, wow, we've got to sort of talk more about, not about non-negotiables and things like that's the wrong language. It's about what are the sort of like fundamental principles that are applicable and can be used to build something that's really allowing that local community to achieve its goals. So kind of a neat kind of way where we kind of made that discovery, and over time, stop talking about a quote unquote Envision model. Instead, a lot of this work is, particular school districts have their own graduate profile or a sense of some larger student, competencies and outcomes, and they want to be able to follow through on those. And we're just actually like sharing some particular assessment practices. And we do try to, describe those in ways that have some quality criteria attached to them, but we try to be descriptive. In other words, the more clients we work with and the more variations we can see, the more we can see like what is what's in common and what is differentiated. And then we just get better and better at describing what those essential elements are. And in some ways, that's what our partners are really, that's where the learning lives, is a kind of a collective, deeper understanding with every new partner, kind of what is at the essence of this and what can be expressed in kind of individual ways. Now, that makes the research dimension of this real complicated, right? So Alex beautifully talked about the trade-offs. And this is a trade-off here where, multi-variables, what happens with the student outcomes and how can we isolate what this did versus that did, et cetera. I've had some great chats with Alan, as he talked about the power of the scientific, method applied to kind of really getting at your results. We've got a long ways to go before we're able to get to where Alan and his organization are and thinking about that. But so the problem might be tougher to solve, but it's still, and I think Alan helps me see this, it's still doable if you come at this with the right kind of approach and runway, where we can kind of figure that out. And that's kind of the next stage for us, is to think about that issue. But in the meantime, what is allowed is like tens of thousands more students than perhaps if we had just gone this like Envision model by Envision model in a real narrow way. Now, all of a sudden, when a school district like Jefferson County Public Schools starts doing portfolio defense for 5th, 8th, and 12th graders, there are tens of thousands of students now engaged in that practice, and it's branded by their backpack of skills. I mean, it's homegrown, and they're proud of it, and they should be. And you can see it, and it's very different than how it looks in Hawaii. But there's also some core dimensions of the student sort of social, emotional, and academic experience that I think we can tease out as powerful. And now we've got to do more study about like what they have in common.
Thank you, Justin. We're getting some great questions in the Q&A box, and just another reminder to keep submitting those, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. I'd love to open one up to all three of our panelists. One question that's been submitted asks how you can think about shifting beyond direct impact when your funding and accompanying oversight are often tied to your direct services. Jaclyn, I saw you nodding. Do you want to jump in there?
Sure. I was jotting down the question and smiling because that is such a good question. It's a challenge for sure. And the one tidbit that I'll offer that I hope is helpful to the person that asked that question is it has to come back to the relationship with the funder and to bringing them along the journey as to why a shift will actually move the dial, not only for the constituents that said organization is focused on serving, but also what I have learned and what we have learned from the uAspire perspective in terms of philanthropy and foundations and funding in particular, and how to bring those entities along is the sustainability question. How do you think about moving from different models to enhance sustainability in different ways? But also for at the end of the day, a funder might change their strategy too, but they want to make sure that they are keeping the organizations that they might be currently funding in a strong position. So by marrying those two and thinking about it also from the funder lens has been one way that uAspire has helped to kind of move money or bridge that understanding of why direct to widespread. And even now we're seeing more conversations with funders about systemic investments. Why that is so important for funders to either expand their funding, which hopefully is the goal, or shift it to one of the different models. It's really the storyline. It's telling the story of why the movement to the models is so important for the mission of the organization and also the impact that the students or again constituents will receive.
Hey, Christine, if I can jump on top of that, I think there's a couple of good examples on this on our side. One is the Overdeck Foundation, terrific foundation out of New York, funded years ago some of our direct work, then saw that we were potentially a major player in this systemic and widespread impact work and has provided significant funding there. The others, international corporations that have foundations, IMC in Chicago has offices around the world. And when the Netherlands was looking for some funding for setting up their program directly, IMC in the Netherlands provided it, knowing that Saga would be the widespread consultant for that new operation setting up in the Netherlands. So there's an expanded pie, I think, that becomes available in the widespread area. We've gotten a lot of resources this year from completely new funders, like Mackenzie Scott and Blue Meridian and others that really saw power in our direct model and wanted to spread that DNA. But even existing funders like Overdeck and IMC saw the possibility of supporting our efforts to support others.
Another question that we have from the audience is, how do you balance continued innovation in your direct impact models when clients demand adopting models that already work or have the evidence? And I'd love to sort of expand that beyond just direct impact as you think about your widespread version of your model as well.
It's hard, right? We have 8 randomized trials, 5 on our core math model. And then we went to New York and to Broward County, Florida, said, look, we want to do something different. That those evaluations were of our in-person model. We want to do a model which is completely remote tutoring with our staff supervising the rooms of kids in the school. There was a little skepticism, but they trusted the evidence from the direct model and our confidence that that evidence could translate into a new version of it. And I think that trust was well placed. I think we'll get better with the new model over time, year by year. We'll get better with it. Our remote model in year 1 was not as good as it is now. We've done 100 improvements with that team that we acquired, uMath, on our technology model, the platform to deliver remote instruction that we didn't have in year 1. So we feel much better about it in year 2. But I think it takes some trust and some confidence in new districts to leap with us into a leap to a new model. And I don't think everybody would do that or be willing to do it. In the New York model, we had private funding from the Gates Foundation that made it easier for the district and the schools to say, yes, we'd like to try it.
I would double down on everything Alan said. And for us, what I see in particular is I'm talking with other leaders and thinking about strategic partnerships. 2 things that stand out, the value proposition that both leaders, whether it's the CEO or other executives and all the way across an organization, have to be willing to go there, have to be willing to try something new and have that same or similar, I should say, same is too strong of a word, but similar investment into innovation at this particular moment in time, and know that it's not going to be the first try is going to be the exact thing that will work for the next set of years. But it is that willingness to try, it's that willingness to take some risk and to actually engage with each other and open up the relationship to be in uncomfortable places to say, well, we thought this was going to work and now it didn't, or to renegotiate the agreements between the partnership. Again, I'll just double down on the trust and the leadership that is core going to be in any successful, innovative project.
The one thing I might add, and this I think is probably specific to a particular kind of way of educational service, but because we are open to, when we work with a district, to kind of figure out what the goals are going to be that are kind of, as I put it earlier, kind of adapted to the context. And sometimes we'll have opinions like the district kind of doesn't feel quite ready to kind of take on X, and so they're wondering if they could do a more modest Y, and we're like but I have found that if one principle that kind of allows us to move forward in a moment like that is, well, can we still frame our goal in the terms of what we'll see differently in terms of a student work? student work or student learning experience. In other words, we're going to still frame our goal where we're going to see some students presenting their learning, or we can look at the student work, or there's some experience that isn't happening now that will be happening in, say, May. If we can frame it in that way, that just allows, I think, both parties to continue with the learning. And sometimes maybe our hunches came true, and we're able to kind of have that conversation and maybe set a different set of goals for the following year if we're going to keep going. So that's been one way that we've found where to kind of ground us, that oftentimes our partner districts are receptive to. It's like, okay, well, let's still frame this in terms of like what we're going to see differently in terms of student work. We want to try student-led conferences instead of a full-blown portfolio defense model. Okay, that would be something that you're not doing now that we can sort of see and look at the results. And so that's been a way that we've kind of sometimes navigated that kind of conversation.
The next question we have in the chat is that pointing to the idea that in the framework, it can kind of feel like direct impact starts when an organization is small, and getting to systemic impact might require organizational expansion. When we were originally thinking about the interconnectedness between the three strategies, we thought of it as more linear, right? You have to start in direct and then move to widespread and then move to systemic. But we ended with the triangle shape and the arrows pointing in all sorts of directions, because we found that it's not a linear process, and organizations in all stages and all sizes can do work in all three and see reinforcing benefits. And so with that in mind, to get to the rest of this person's question, they'd love to hear more about the capacities that feel important for an organization to have to do that systemic impact work. So whether or not size or scale of your organization is one of those, what are those capacities you think are important to be able to effectively support systemic impact work?
I'll jump in here if I could. And Justin and I have talked about this, as you mentioned. I think having strong scientific evidence in the highest level being randomized control trial, but obviously there are other levels, is really crucial to being a player who's listened to in the systemic impact stage. I think relatedly, this is more tactical. I think having partnership with organizations that are skilled at public relations and even legislative relations can be very helpful when some of the issues that we face are state law, state regulations, federal policies, the possibility of federal support and grants. Having organizations that are really skilled in that area. We have one called Whiteboard Advisors and another called Fulcrum Associates. Have been really helpful to get the word out and ultimately make a difference. You know, those are great partnership. In Colorado, there was a bill introduced, and with our connections, AJ Gutierrez got a chance to testify, and the bill became law in the state of Colorado, setting parameters for high dosage tutoring. So these things are important. Nothing we really thought about in our first few years, but as we seek to play on a bigger stage, we need people who have expertise in those areas of PR and legislative affairs.
I would another aspect of I think I see Ariana's question here that I appreciate is the note that systemic impact is not limited to policy, but also to culture, practice, and operational. I really resonate with that, and I know that when I spoke about systemic impact earlier, I think I just used the term policy, but wanted to add that, like, you know, movement building is a key aspect of following through on a mission, especially for many, I think, the nonprofit leaders and educational entrepreneurs. And fortunately, that's often is very instinctive to those that are drawn to this kind of work. And so I think that what are capacities important to, you know, is to kind of follow some of those oftentimes good instincts and energies around being involved in the movement building that's related to your particular organizational mission. In our case, we're interested in expanding the notion of kind of what is effective assessment. And there are lots of different orgs and ways to plug into that larger movement. We've gotten involved in being involved in putting on conferences with other like-minded orgs around that kind of work, finding opportunities to convene districts that are all committed to these kinds of things. It's worth our time. And I think that's a form of systemic impact, to be kind of make a powerful idea a bit more of a household concept, so to speak. I used to be on the board of directors for the Buck Institute for Education, now PBL Works, and I think that organization did a beautiful job of really trying to make project-based learning, among other organizations as well, but they were a leader in trying to make project-based learning just like such a commonly known phrase, whether people were doing it or not. I think it's just the awareness of that as a pedagogy that's worth thinking about is an important part of setting the stage for deeper forms of change that can follow. And so similarly, when my organization thinks about performance assessment, because that's what our mission's, we do put energy through social media, conference attendance, finding opportunities to kind of do our stump speech, so to speak, on the road, that just continue to kind of expand people's awareness of and potential appreciation of and potential commitment to that concept down the line.
I'll just add really quickly, Alan, you mentioned it, but I want to make sure to put a very fine point on it because it's something that uAspire tries to keep at the forefront, is the operational capacity. So we talked a little bit more about the programmatic expertise and capacities, but you have to also keep your eye on the operational capacities that are required. So as you shift funding, do you have someone who can write the federal contracts, the state grants, who understand those contracts? It's a whole different fundraising skill set to go after 5, 6, 7, 8-figure investments from different systems that will help to support and drive your goals on systemic change. So fundraising, finance, contracting capacity, but then also evaluation. Do you have the right kind of evaluators, either internally or externally, that can help you track your results, track the goals? So the operational questions as it relates to the capacity question is also one to not lose sight of.
There have been so many words of wisdom already over the past hour. And as we come up on time, I'm going to ask each of you for one final piece of wisdom, advice, or lesson learned you'd want to share with those who've joined us today as you reflect on your journey so far and where you're headed. Justin, why don't you go first?
Sure. I mean, what pops to mind immediately is perhaps to underscore a point I recently made about sort of challenging, in thinking about whatever layer of impact, direct, widespread, or systemic, is challenging yourself, your org, to be really thinking about how is this going to sort of play out in terms of actual student learning experiences. Can we show, don't tell this? I do sometimes fall prey, like perhaps others, to thinking about the next part of our strategic plan and this, that, and we kind of get into some of these abstractions, and we sort of realize that we're making moves where you see more of the impact around kind of what adults are doing or what they're thinking about, et cetera, which is reasonable because these are kind of means to ends, of course. But if we can continue to have the discipline to translate, like, how is that going to end up changing student learning experiences, and what will we see when those student learning experiences make the corresponding shift? Just describing that with crisp language, I think, can be really helpful in thinking about all three layers of impact.
Thanks, Justin. Alan, how about you next?
I'm going to say two things that cognitive dissonance allows me to hold in my head at the same time. Go slow to go fast, and if not now, when? Both, I think, are true. We're trying to help states and districts to do tutoring right, and we think they need to go slow to ultimately go fast. But if they don't start now, if not us, who? If not now, when? It's the time. This is an opportunity that my dad and my mom were both teachers, didn't see in their lifetimes, and I want to see it in our lifetime, that we can make some major changes in American public school that will make a difference for the kids who are experiencing poverty, who disproportionately are Black and brown in this country. It's time for that. So if those on this call who have a good program need to scale it. Those who are looking to fund a good program need to find those. Those who are districts and others and states looking to do what's right by kids. There's a lot of opportunity here with all this federal stimulus and all this crisis in our schools to really seize the opportunity, if not now, when.
And I'll just say that don't allow yourself to think you've arrived. uAspire has direct, widespread, and systemic, and we have to keep on evolving, both to what points Justin made in terms of, is this serving the students? And to what Alan just said, if it's not now, when? You can't become complacent. Just because you have potentially, maybe you've arrived and you have these 3 models, does not mean that you can kind of sit back on your heels and let them play themselves out. You have to constantly drive those models forward, change them, push them, shift them, and evolve them. Even if it means, setting one aside to focus on the other 2, or deepening or changing the strategy within one. Arriving needs to be focused on what the students need at that moment in time. And when those change, you have to not only be able to respond to it, but actually be proactively strategizing around changes that you're seeing happening with the students that you're serving.
Great, thank you all. It's amazing how quickly an hour goes. We're at time. So I just want to again thank our panelists, thank Christine and the Bellwether communications team, thank New Profit for funding this effort, and thank all of you for joining us today. We are all on a journey on this. We would love to continue to hear from you and learn from you, so feel free to reach out to us. Again, feel free to avail yourselves of the content that we have. And again, thank you for the time.